The black ships appear in historical records not as singular anomalies, but as recurring presences whose documentation spans centuries yet resists systematic analysis. The phenomenon enters modern institutional awareness through fragments, a ship captain's marginal note, an astronomer's retracted observation, a telegraph operator's unexplained signal, each isolated until comparative research reveals patterns suggesting not random occurrence, but scheduled transit. The significance lies not in individual sightings, which remain ambiguous and contestable, but in the aggregate data showing geometric consistency across temporal and spatial scales that exceed coincidental explanation. These are not UFO reports in the conventional sense of misidentified aircraft or atmospheric phenomena, but documented encounters with objects whose properties and trajectories imply origin and purpose outside terrestrial or even solar frameworks. The earliest recorded mention appears in a Dutch maritime log dated 1638, recovered from archives in Amsterdam and translated for inclusion in Miskatonic University's Comparative Anomaly database. The entry, written by a navigator whose name survives only as Van Hook, describes observing during a night watch what he terms vessels without sail or flame, drifting against the fixed stars as if the firmament itself had grown shipping lanes. The description is brief, occupying 3 lines in a log otherwise devoted to mundane navigation and cargo tallies, but it establishes several characteristics that will recur across subsequent reports: motion independent of visible propulsion, silhouette discernible against stellar background, and trajectory that appears to violate astronomical expectations for meteors or comets. The account languishes in obscurity for over 2 centuries until comparative researchers at Miskatonic identify similar descriptions in other maritime records from the same approximate period. A Portuguese logbook from 1641 references dark galleons that cross the night, and a French trading vessel's manifest from 1652 includes a marginal notation about shadows that moved where no clouds could cast them. The geographic distribution of these early sightings shows no obvious pattern. Observations occur across the Atlantic, in the North Sea, and off the coast of West Africa, suggesting either multiple simultaneous phenomena or objects capable of traversing vast distances between observation events. The next significant cluster of sightings occurs in 1882, correlated with a period of intense auroral activity across the Northern Hemisphere. During October and November of that year, multiple observers across Northern Europe and North America report unusual aerial phenomena distinct from the auroral displays themselves. A professor at the University of Copenhagen documents seeing elongated darknesses moving against the aurora, as if holes had been cut in the luminous curtain. An amateur astronomer in Maine writes to colleagues describing cigar-shaped voids that absorbed starlight rather than reflecting it. Most significantly, a Royal Observatory report from Greenwich notes unidentified moving objects observed during auroral maximum, motion inconsistent with balloon or atmospheric refraction, no satisfactory explanation proposed. The 1882 sightings attract brief scientific attention before being dismissed as misidentifications of meteor shower activity. The Andromedids produced notable displays during the same period, or as psychological effects of the unusual auroral conditions. However, the geographic distribution of reports and the consistency of descriptions across independent observers resist easy dismissal. The objects are consistently described as elongated, dark or light-absorbing, moving with apparent purpose rather than ballistic trajectories, and silent. No sonic phenomena accompany their passage, distinguishing them from meteors which typically produce sound effects when observed from proximity. The most thoroughly documented early 20th century encounter occurs in April 1919 at an observatory in rural Vermont. The facility, operated by a private foundation with ties to Miskatonic University, maintains regular sky surveys using photographic plates and visual observation. During a routine night session, 3 staff members observe what they initially assume to be a satellite or high-altitude aircraft moving across the field of view. The object moves too slowly for a meteor, too steadily for a balloon in wind, and exhibits no lights or exhaust, consistent with known aircraft of the period. The observers attempt to photograph it using the observatory's main telescope equipped with plate camera. The resulting photographic evidence proves problematic. The plates, when developed, show extensive damage despite being properly handled and processed. Instead of capturing the object, the images display burn lines, overexposed tracks, and reticulation patterns where the emulsion has broken down. The damage is localized to areas where the object appeared during observation, with surrounding star fields recording normally. Subsequent plates taken immediately after the object's passage show no unusual effects, suggesting the damage occurred during exposure, specifically when the object was in frame. Chemical analysis of the damaged emulsion finds no contaminants or processing errors that would explain the failure. The observatory staff prepare a formal report for submission to astronomical journals, but withdraw it before publication following consultation with Miskatonic researchers. The withdrawal is attributed to inability to substantiate findings with reproducible evidence, but internal correspondence suggests concern about professional reputation and the unusual nature of secondary effects experienced by observers. All 3 staff members report persistent tinnitus, ringing in the ears, for several days following the observation. 2 experience temporal disorientation, describing episodes where they lose several seconds of conscious awareness, marked by clocks showing elapsed time they cannot account for. These symptoms resolve within a week, but are severe enough during the immediate aftermath that one observer requires medical evaluation. Instrumental effects documented during the 1919 sighting establish a pattern that subsequent investigations will confirm. Magnetic compasses in the observatory show deflection during the object's passage, needles moving off north by approximately 15 degrees, then returning to normal alignment after the object departs. This deflection is recorded by multiple instruments simultaneously, ruling out localized disturbance to individual compasses. A pendulum clock in the main observation room loses synchronization with a chronometer in an adjacent building, falling behind by exactly 7 seconds. When the clocks are compared after the event, the pendulum clock has resumed normal rate but remains 7 seconds slow, a discrepancy that persists until the clock is manually reset. Archival research conducted in the 1940s and 1950s identifies enough similar reports to allow statistical analysis and pattern recognition. Researchers at Miskatonic develop a classification system dividing sightings into 3 categories based on evidence quality and associated phenomena. Class 1 sightings are attributed to atmospheric effects, temperature inversions creating mirages, unusual cloud formations, or astronomical objects misidentified under poor observing conditions. This category accounts for the majority of reports and can be explained through conventional meteorology and optics. Class 2 sightings involve aerial or orbital objects verified by multiple independent instruments, photographic, visual, and instrumental, but showing no definitively anomalous characteristics beyond unusual appearance or trajectory. These might represent advanced human technology, natural phenomena not yet well understood, or genuine anomalies that resist definitive classification. Class 3 sightings display properties inconsistent with conventional explanation and show correlation with other documented anomalous phenomena, psychic disturbances, cult activity, or geographic locations known for unusual occurrences. Only 4 sightings receive Class 3 designation through the mid-20th century. The first occurs in 1919 at the Vermont Observatory already discussed. The second is documented in 1928 near Dunwich, Massachusetts, where residents report seeing dark objects moving across the sky during the period immediately following the Whately incident. The third occurs in 1931 in Antarctica, observed by wireless operators at a remote research station who report both visual sighting and unusual electromagnetic signals. The fourth is recorded in 1947 in northern Canada, where a meteorological observation post documents objects moving in formation against background stars, accompanied by instrument malfunctions and loss of radio contact with other stations. Geographic and temporal analysis of Class 3 sightings reveals patterns suggesting intentional navigation rather than random appearance. When sighting locations are plotted and vectors calculated based on reported motion, the trajectories converge toward a region of space in the outer solar system associated with the hypothetical planet Yuggoth. The convergence is not perfect. Observational uncertainty and the limited number of data points prevent precise determination, but multiple independent calculations produce similar results, placing the apparent origin point somewhere beyond Neptune's orbit. From this outer region, trajectories angle sunward, following eccentric paths that bring objects near Earth, with closest approaches occurring over northern latitudes, typically during periods of minimal solar activity. The periodicity of sightings suggests a schedule rather than continuous activity. Major sighting clusters occur approximately every 73 years, with variance less than 2%. The 1638 and 1882 observations bracket a 244-year period, not matching the 73-year cycle, but detailed analysis reveals smaller clusters in 1711 and 1784 that were not recognized as related phenomena at the time, but whose descriptions align with black ship characteristics. When all documented sightings are plotted chronologically, peaks occur at 1638, 1711, 1784, 1857, undocumented but predicted by the pattern, and 1930. With documented events in 1928 and 1931 falling within the window. The next predicted peak would fall in 2003, allowing for prospective verification. The consistency of this timing across centuries implies either an astronomically determined cycle, objects following orbits with specific periods, or deliberate scheduling by controlling intelligence. Natural orbital periods of 73 years do exist. Halley's Comet has a period of approximately 76 years, close but not matching, but the precision of the black ship cycle and the complexity of trajectories argue against simple orbital mechanics. Multiple objects would need to follow coordinated paths, converging from different approach vectors at synchronized times. A level of precision suggesting either advanced propulsion and navigation or a swarm of objects locked into resonant orbits through gravitational interactions. Documentation recovered from Arkham Observatory archives provides additional correlation between black ship passages and electromagnetic anomalies. During the 1919 Vermont sighting, radio receivers at Arkham, roughly 40 miles distant, detected bursts of interference on multiple frequencies. The interference patterns were recorded on strip chart recorders, producing traces showing repeating pulses with precise timing intervals. Analysis of these recordings decades later, after comparable patterns were found in MyGo artifact research, reveals that the Arkham signals match harmonic frequencies associated with the alien technology recovered during the Whisperer in Darkness investigation in Vermont in 1926. The frequencies are not identical, but are integer multiples of a fundamental frequency, suggesting either shared engineering principles or signals originating from the same source. The visual structure of the black ships, reconstructed from multiple witness accounts using techniques borrowed from forensic psychology and composite portraiture, shows remarkable consistency despite witnesses having no contact with each other and sightings being separated by decades or centuries. The objects are elongated, cylindrical, or cigar-shaped, with aspect ratios, length to width typically between 5:1 and 10:1. The surfaces appear smooth without visible features such as windows, hatches, or markings. The color, or more precisely the absence of color, is described consistently as black or dark gray, but with the unusual property that the surface seems to absorb light rather than merely failing to reflect it. Witnesses report that when black ships pass in front of star fields, the stars do not simply disappear behind the object as would occur with any opaque body, but seem to be consumed or extinguished, with a zone of darkness larger than the object's apparent physical extent. The motion characteristics distinguish black ships from any known natural or artificial objects. They move smoothly without visible acceleration or deceleration, maintaining constant apparent angular velocity across the sky. They do not tumble or rotate, as would be expected for unpowered objects in ballistic flight. Their trajectories often involve changes in direction that would require thrust but produce no visible exhaust, no thermal signature, and no acoustic effects. Speed estimates vary widely depending on assumptions about distance. Objects could be small and close or large and distant, but when triangulation is possible through multiple observation sites, velocities are calculated in the range of several kilometers per second, faster than aircraft but slower than meteors. The hull structure, described during trance recall sessions conducted with witnesses years after their observations, shows modular construction with plate segments that appear to rotate independently. Witnesses under hypnotic regression describe seeing the surface as composed of overlapping sections that slide past each other without visible seams or joints, creating an impression of fluidity despite the rigidity of angles and overall shape. This description aligns with no known human technology, but bears resemblance to theoretical designs for spacecraft using electromagnetic field manipulation for structural integrity rather than mechanical fasteners. The rotation of segments is reported as slow, completing a full rotation over periods of minutes, and appears purposeless from an engineering standpoint unless it serves some function in propulsion or field generation. The shadow-consuming property receives particular emphasis in multiple accounts. When black ships pass near bright stars or planetary bodies, witnesses report that the zone of darkness extends noticeably beyond the object's physical outline. Light approaching the hull appears to bend toward it, creating distortion effects similar to gravitational lensing but on a scale disproportionate to any mass the object might plausibly possess. Photometric measurements, attempted during the few occasions when instruments were trained on objects in time, show dimming of background stars before the object's arrival in their apparent position and continued dimming after the object has passed, suggesting either a wake effect or that the darkness propagates independently of the physical object. Temperature measurements prove impossible during sightings. Objects are typically too distant for thermal instruments of the period, but witnesses who claim proximity report no sensation of heat or cold radiating from the objects. This absence of thermal signature is itself anomalous. Any object absorbing starlight should re-radiate in infrared unless the absorbed energy is being stored or converted through some unknown process. The lack of detectable thermal emission suggests either perfect insulation, energy conversion so efficient that waste heat is negligible, or that the objects exist partially outside conventional thermodynamic frameworks. Cross-referencing. Black ship descriptions with ancient sources provides disturbing confirmation of long-term presence. Mesopotamian cylinder seals, held in Miskatonic's restricted collection, depict what translators describe as sky coffins borne by cold winds, vessels that ferry souls of knowledge between stars. The imagery shows elongated objects surrounded by stars, with smaller figures, whether passengers or cargo, contained within. A marginal gloss in Akkadian attributes these vessels to the keepers of the outer books, beings described as existing beyond the sphere of fixed stars and engaging in trade not of material goods, but of consciousness and information. Carbon dating and stylistic analysis place these seals in the early 2nd millennium BCE, over 3,000 years before modern sightings, yet the depicted geometry matches reported black ship configurations with uncomfortable precision. Similar references appear in other ancient sources examined through the lens of anomalous phenomena research. Egyptian papyri fragments reference barks of the night sky that carry blessed souls to realms beyond death, descriptions usually interpreted as purely mythological until comparative analysis reveals technical details. The barks are described as having no oars, sails, or visible crew, moving against the current of the sky, just as black ships move against apparent gravitational expectations. Chinese astronomical records from the Han Dynasty document guest stars that moved slowly across the heavens over periods of days, unlike meteors or comets, and were considered omens of significant change. When the recorded paths of these guest stars are reconstructed, several match the convergence patterns identified in modern black ship trajectory analysis. Within institutional documentation maintained by Miskatonic and cooperating universities, black ships functions as operational shorthand for the phenomenon, a designation that acknowledges historical precedent while avoiding commitment to specific interpretation. The term appears in classified memoranda, research proposals, and incident reports with sufficient frequency to indicate that the phenomenon is taken seriously by at least some segments of the academic and possibly governmental establishment. The ships are discussed not as folklore or mass hysteria, but as recurring physical objects or phenomena whose properties resist conventional explanation but can be tracked, predicted, and analyzed within limits. The operational hypothesis that emerges from cumulative analysis treats the black ships not as exploration vessels or invasion forces, but as logistics infrastructure, the equivalent of cargo ships or freight trains operating along established routes according to fixed schedules. This interpretation explains the geometric precision of trajectories, the periodicity of appearances, and the apparent indifference to human observation. The ships are not evading detection or seeking contact. They are following protocols that predate human civilization and continue regardless of terrestrial awareness. Each passage represents a scheduled transit, a movement of cargo or information between nodes in a network spanning interstellar or possibly interdimensional space. The nature of the cargo remains speculative, but multiple lines of evidence suggest informational rather than purely material transfer. The electromagnetic emissions detected during passages, the consciousness-related phenomena reported by witnesses, and the historical references to souls or knowledge being transported all point toward data, minds, or some form of non-physical commodity being moved. If the black ships operate as transports for consciousness, whether uploaded minds, psychic recordings, or entities whose existence is fundamentally informational, then their technical properties make more sense. The lack of visible life support, the absence of apparent crew, and the extreme environments they transit without visible damage are consistent with vessels designed to carry data storage media rather than biological organisms. The relationship between black ship passages and terrestrial anomalous phenomena provides additional context. Upticks in forbidden text circulation, unexplained disappearances from academic collections, and increases in cult activity often correlate with predicted passage windows. This pattern suggests either that the ships deliver or retrieve materials during Earth approaches, or that their proximity enables phenomena otherwise suppressed or latent. The correlation is not perfect. Many passages occur without documented terrestrial effects, and anomalous events occur between passages. but the statistical association exceeds chance expectation, implying causal relationship even if mechanism remains unclear. The maintenance hypothesis treats black ship activity as cosmic infrastructure management. If reality requires periodic adjustment to maintain stability, if dimensional boundaries need reinforcement, if energy flows must be balanced, or if information networks require updating, then regular scheduled transits by specialized vessels become necessary. The ships would function as repair vehicles or data couriers, following routes that maintain the larger system's equilibrium. In this reading, Earth is not the destination, but simply one node among many, a waypoint in a network whose scale and purpose dwarf human comprehension. The 73-year cycle might reflect not the ship's limitations, but the maintenance interval required by cosmic infrastructure, a schedule determined by factors operating on scales that make planetary orbits seem brief. This interpretation transforms the question of control from who operates these ships to what system do they serve. If the black ships are autonomous or semi-autonomous components of a self-maintaining network established eons ago, then current control may not exist in any meaningful sense. The ships operate because operation is their function, continuing long after their designers disappeared, executing protocols whose original purpose may have become irrelevant but whose infrastructure persists. The void crosses itself through them, maintaining pathways whose necessity is measured in cosmic rather than human timescales, indifferent to whether anyone watches, records, or attempts to understand the passages they witness. Three competing frameworks dominate theoretical analysis of black ship origins, each drawing on different bodies of evidence and producing incompatible conclusions about the vessel's creators, purposes, and operational principles. The frameworks are not merely academic exercises but reflect fundamental disagreements about the nature of reality and humanity's place within cosmic hierarchies. Which model researchers favor depends less on evidence, which remains ambiguous and incomplete, than on which anomalous phenomena they consider primary and which they treat as derivative. The MyGo industrial model emphasizes technological continuity and material engineering. The Elder Thing colonial model privileges archaeological evidence and deep time, while the Yithian archival model foregrounds consciousness transfer and temporal rather than spatial displacement. No synthesis reconciles all three perspectives, suggesting either that the black ships represent multiple distinct phenomena incorrectly grouped together, or that the vessels operate according to principles that human conceptual frameworks cannot adequately capture. The MyGo industrial hypothesis treats the black ships as advanced spacecraft constructed by the fungus entities known to inhabit Yuggoth and to maintain presence on Earth through clandestine operations, documented most thoroughly in Vermont during the 1920s. The model proposes that what appear to be ships are actually atmospheric vessels, craft designed primarily for planetary operations, that have been adapted or extended for interplanetary travel through technologies the MyGo possess, but humans barely comprehend. The adaptation would involve field manipulation, allowing the vessels to create localized environments, insulating them from vacuum, radiation, and temperature extremes of space, while propulsion operates through the same principles that enable individual MyGo to transit between worlds without conventional spacecraft. Supporting evidence for MyGo origin begins with electromagnetic signature analysis. The resonance frequencies detected during black ship passages match, within instrumental precision, the frequencies documented in MyGo artifacts recovered during the Vermont incidents. The brain cylinders that the fungi use to transport human consciousness produce electromagnetic emissions when active, emissions that fall within specific frequency bands and display harmonic relationships following mathematical patterns. Radio interference recorded during the 1919 Vermont sighting shows these same harmonic patterns. suggesting either that the black ships incorporate MIGO technology or that both phenomena derive from common engineering principles. The match is not perfect. Frequencies are related as integer multiples rather than identical, but the underlying mathematical structure is consistent across samples. Physical residue provides additional correlation. Meteoric material recovered near the Vermont Observatory shortly after the 1919 sighting contains trace amounts of organic compounds whose molecular structure resembles fungal chitin, but shows thermal stability far exceeding any terrestrial organism. Spectroscopic analysis reveals carbon-nitrogen bonds in configurations that require formation under conditions of extreme cold and low pressure. Conditions consistent with Yuggoth's environment as described in surviving accounts from individuals who claim to have experienced MIGO captivity. The material is fragmentary, possibly representing debris or exhaust rather than structural components, but its presence at the sighting location and its chemical similarity to known MIGO biological matter establish circumstantial linkage. The counter-arguments against MIGO authorship focus on scale and operational logic. All documented MIGO activities emphasize individual or small group operations. The brain cylinders transport single consciousnesses. The Vermont operation involved perhaps dozens of entities managing a mining and research facility. Even generous estimates of MIGO presence on Earth suggest a population measured in hundreds, not thousands, operating through scattered bases rather than centralized infrastructure. Why would a species capable of transferring consciousness instantaneously across interstellar distances require physical transport vessels measuring hundreds of meters in length? If the goal is moving information or minds, the brain cylinder technology already provides more efficient means. If the goal is moving physical materials, mining output, manufactured goods, biological specimens, the observed black ship traffic volume seems grossly insufficient for supplying even a modest colony. Proponents respond that the black ships might serve specialized functions that brain cylinder technology cannot fulfill. Perhaps certain types of cargo, living organisms that must remain embodied, artifacts whose properties depend on maintaining specific spatial configurations, or materials that interfere with consciousness transfer, require physical transport. Alternatively, the ships might function as templates or anchor points for consciousness transfer operations, physical waypoints that allow brain cylinders to sync and download at specific locations rather than requiring continuous operation across full interstellar distances. In this model, the ships would be relay stations as much as transport vessels, maintaining the infrastructure that enables the apparently simpler technology. The Elder Thing colonial hypothesis shifts the timeline dramatically, proposing that the black ships predate not only humanity, but the MIGO presence on Earth by hundreds of millions of years. This model draws its primary evidence from the Antarctic ruins explored in the 1930s and documented in the Dyer Danforth expedition reports. Among the extensive murals depicting Elder Thing history and activities across geological epochs, several panels show cylindrical objects crossing star fields, moving between planetary bodies, and approaching a world whose geographic features match a pre-continental drift Earth. The cylinders lack any visible propulsion mechanism, wings, or external details, appearing as smooth, elongated forms exactly matching black ship descriptions from modern sightings. The murals were executed in mineral pigments, whose chemistry provides indirect dating. Spectroscopic analysis of the pigments identifies carbon allotropes, structural variants of carbon atoms in specific ratios that match samples collected from interplanetary dust during the 1882 Andromedid meteor shower. This shower occurred during the same year as a major black ship sighting cluster, suggesting possible connection between the meteoric material and the vessels. If the murals and the meteoric dust share carbon sources, and if the murals accurately depict actual vessels the Elder Things encountered or operated, then the black ships might be remnants of pre-Cambrian technology, still functioning millions of years after their creator's civilization collapsed. Chemical dating of the mural pigments places their application between 50 and 30 million years ago, during the Eocene or Oligocene epochs when the Elder Things were still active in Antarctica. The depicted vessels show no obvious evolution across different mural panels. They appear identical whether shown in ancient star-crossing scenes or in more recent contexts, suggesting either that the design was perfected early and never changed, or that the vessels were already ancient when the Elder Things encountered them. Some mural sequences show Elder Things inside or near the cylindrical objects, but the relationship is ambiguous. Are the Elder Things operating the vessels, being transported by them, or merely documenting phenomena they observed but did not control? The Elder Thing model resolves several puzzles that the MyGo hypothesis struggles with. The immense time scale, regular transits continuing across tens of millions of years, makes more sense if the vessels are autonomous systems maintained by self-repairing mechanisms rather than actively operated by a biological species. The apparent indifference to human observation follows naturally if the ships predate humanity by such vast intervals that our existence registers as merely the most recent brief flicker in a surveillance record spanning geological epochs. The scale of the vessels, seemingly oversized for efficient transport, makes sense if they were designed for civilization-scale evacuation or colonization efforts by a species that built on grand scales, as evidenced by their architectural remains. Counter-arguments note that preservation across such timescales seems implausible. The Antarctic ruins themselves show extensive decay despite the preservative effects of cold and isolation. Metal corrodes, stone erodes, and even the most sophisticated technology degrades over millions of years unless actively maintained. If the black ships are Elder Thing relics operating autonomously, they must incorporate self-repair systems of extraordinary sophistication, effectively achieving immortality for complex mechanical systems. While the Elder Things' biological and engineering capabilities were clearly far beyond human levels, the leap to permanent self-maintaining spacecraft requires additional assumptions. Additionally, the mural evidence could represent not Elder Thing technology, but documentation of other beings' vessels. The murals might record contact with the actual black ship operators, whoever they were, rather than depicting Elder Thing achievements. The Yithian archival hypothesis represents the most radical reframing, proposing that the black ships are not physical spacecraft at all, but temporal projection devices or consciousness storage matrices that only appear as material objects to human perception. The great race of Yith possessed technology, allowing them to project consciousness across time, swapping minds between bodies separated by millions of years. Their technology also included vast libraries storing not books but minds, archived consciousnesses preserved in crystalline matrices or electromagnetic fields for later study or resurrection. If the black ships are mobile versions of these archives, they would not need conventional propulsion because they are not moving through space in the usual sense, but translating between temporal positions, with spatial displacement occurring as a side effect of temporal navigation. Evidence supporting Yithian involvement begins with psychological rather than physical data. During the period between 1925 and 1935, several individuals across New England reported unusual dreams and psychological experiences later grouped under the label Dunwich Dreamers by researchers investigating connections between the Whately incident and broader anomalous phenomena. Subjects described recurring visions of vast libraries extending through impossible spaces, of corridors lined with crystalline storage media, and of the sensation of being cataloged and filed like reference materials. Several subjects reported that these libraries were moving, that they could sense the structures traveling through darkness while simultaneously spanning immense distances. The dreams intensified during periods of strong magnetic storm activity, suggesting electromagnetic triggering or enhancement of the experiences. Electroencephalography performed on several subjects during dream states revealed rhythmic patterns in their brainwave activity, regularized oscillations at specific frequencies that match patterns recorded during alleged Yithian mental contact events documented in Australia and other locations. The match is not conclusive, but is sufficiently close that researchers familiar with both data sets recognize the similarity immediately. If the Dunwich dreamers were experiencing genuine contact with Yithian technology rather than purely psychological phenomena, their descriptions of mobile libraries correspond remarkably well to what black ships might be from an internal perspective, consciousness storage systems in transit. The temporal translation model explains several otherwise puzzling features of black ship observations. The difficulties photographing the objects could result from temporal displacement, the ships existing partially in different time frames, so cameras capture only fragments or distortions rather than complete images. The time perception gaps. Witnesses' experience could be synchronization artifacts, moments when their consciousness briefly aligns with the ship's temporal reference frame. The absence of visible propulsion makes sense if the ships are not pushing against space, but stepping through time, with apparent motion being the three-dimensional projection of four-dimensional translation. The 73-year cycle could represent not orbital period, but a resonance frequency in Earth's temporal structure. Times when the planet's position in space-time makes it accessible to Yithian navigation. Objections to the Yithian model note the lack of any documented Yithian interest in regular Earth contact during recent epochs. The great race's primary presence on Earth occurred in the Paleozoic, roughly 200 to 300 million years ago, when they occupied cone-shaped bodies before projecting forward to escape a disaster. Their subsequent interactions with Earth appear sporadic and indirect, involving individual consciousness swaps for research purposes rather than routine physical or even psychic visitation. Why would Yithian archives need to physically approach Earth on regular schedules if their technology allows direct mental contact across time? Unless the archives are not under active Yithian control but represent automated systems continuing to operate according to protocols established millions of years ago, the regular transit schedule seems inconsistent with what is known of Yithian behavior and interests. Crew composition remains the most speculative aspect of black ship analysis because direct observation has never occurred. No human has verifiably entered a black ship and returned to report its interior. No crew members have been observed, photographed, or detected through any instrument. The vessels operate with apparent intelligence, navigating precisely, responding to obstacles if any exist, maintaining schedules, yet show no signs of biological pilots or even obvious control centers. This absence generates two competing interpretations. The ships are fully autonomous, operated by artificial intelligence or pre-programmed systems that require no living crew, or the ships are crewed by entities whose nature precludes detection by human senses and instruments, existing in dimensional states or energy forms that leave no signature human technology can register. Two instances of apparent communication provide the only direct evidence that might illuminate crew identity, or at least prove that some form of intelligence monitors the vessels. The first incident occurs in 1931 at an Antarctic wireless station operated jointly by Norwegian and American researchers conducting magnetic and atmospheric studies. During the night of August 17th, radio operators receive a series of acoustic transmissions on frequencies they use for time signals and meteorological coordination. The transmissions consist of ultra-low frequency pulses, each lasting approximately 3 seconds, separated by intervals of exactly 5 seconds. The pattern continues for 14 minutes, cycling through a sequence that operators recognize as prime numbers: 2 pulses, 3 pulses, 5 pulses, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, and then cessation. The transmission is received simultaneously on multiple receivers, ruling out local equipment malfunction. The source direction, determined through antenna orientation experiments conducted during the transmission, comes from approximately 45 degrees above the horizon in the Yoggoth south-southeast direction. No aircraft are in the vicinity. The station is extremely remote and would have been alerted to any flight operations in the region. Weather conditions are clear, eliminating atmospheric reflection as an explanation. Most significantly, the transmission occurs during a night when one of the Antarctic observation posts documents visual sighting of an unidentified dark object moving across the southern celestial hemisphere. A sighting that matches black ship descriptions and timing that makes it temporally coincident with the radio transmission. The prime number sequence is universally recognized among mathematicians and scientists as a potential communication protocol for establishing contact with non-human intelligence. Prime numbers are mathematically fundamental, independent of any particular number base or counting system, making them ideal for demonstrating conscious intelligence to observers who might not share language or cultural context. The fact that the sequence stops at 19, rather than continuing indefinitely, suggests either that the sender considered the pattern adequately established or that something about the number 19 holds significance. Numerological analysis proves fruitless, but some researchers note that 19 is the 8th prime number, and 8 appears as a significant number in certain Elder Thing geometric patterns documented in the Antarctic ruins. The second communication event, known as the Arkham Reply, occurs decades later in 1953. Miskatonic University maintains a small radio observatory for conducting ionospheric research and monitoring solar activity. On the night of March 4th, operators receive an unexpected signal on a frequency normally used for internal communications between different buildings on campus. The signal triggers a teleprinter connected to the receiver, producing a single line of text: "Cargo received." The message prints in standard ASCII equivalent code used by mid-20th century telecommunications systems, suggesting either that the sender understands terrestrial protocols or that the message passed through a translation layer somewhere in the transmission chain. The timestamp on the message, 003.4722 local time, coincides precisely with 2 other documented events. At the same moment, the campus power grid experiences a momentary blackout lasting approximately 2 seconds, affecting primarily the research buildings in the eastern quadrant. Simultaneously, a magnetometer operating in the university's geophysics laboratory records a sharp spike in local magnetic field strength, a transient event lasting about 5 seconds. Neither the blackout nor the magnetic spike has an obvious prosaic cause: no storm activity, no equipment failure, no scheduled maintenance. The combination of radio message, power disruption, and magnetic anomaly occurring simultaneously suggests a single causal event, one possessing both electromagnetic and power system effects. Efforts to trace the radio signal's origin prove inconclusive. The message appears to have been transmitted from within the campus network, but no station was operating on that frequency at that time. Security checks find no unauthorized access to communications equipment. The content of the message, "Cargo received," implies acknowledgement of a delivery or completion of a transfer, but no corresponding cargo shipment or transmission from the university can be identified. The simplest interpretation is that the message originated externally, from whatever caused the magnetic and power anomalies, and that "cargo received" refers to something the university was not aware it was sending. Speculation centers on whether the event represents extraction of information from the university's extensive archives, possibly through electromagnetic means that could read library holdings, computer records, or even human memories without physical access. Physical trace evidence from black ship passages provides more concrete, though equally puzzling data. At irregular intervals, typically within days or weeks of predicted transit windows, craters appear at remote locations around the globe. These craters share distinctive characteristics that distinguish them from meteor impacts or conventional explosions. They are typically circular, with diameters between 10 and 50 meters, shallow relative to their width, and feature floors of fused glass or glassy slag rather than pulverized rock. The glass shows flow patterns, suggesting extreme heat applied rapidly, melting rock and soil to liquid state that then cooled quickly into a vitreous material. Isotopic analysis of the fused material reveals anomalies that defy explanation through conventional heating mechanisms. Oxygen isotope ratios differ from both the surrounding soil and from ratios expected from terrestrial materials exposed to known heat sources. Trace elements appear in proportions that would require fractionation processes not achievable through simple melting. Most dramatically, some samples show isotopic signatures that appear to require nuclear reactions, presence of isotopes whose abundance can only be explained by neutron bombardment or other nuclear processes, yet lack the expected byproducts of fission or fusion reactions. The patterns suggest exposure to forms of energy that interact with atomic nuclei but through mechanisms that differ from any terrestrial nuclear technology or natural process. The craters appear at coordinates that, when analyzed for geographic patterns, correlate with predicted entry or exit vectors for black ship trajectories. The correlation is not perfect. Many predicted passages produce no craters, and some crater appearances occur without corresponding sightings, but the statistical association exceeds chance expectation. The implication is that the craters represent either landing takeoff sites for vessels that sometimes but not always physically touch down, or they mark locations where cargo is transferred through energy beams or field effects that leave these characteristic traces. The shallow depth suggests gentle rather than violent interaction, more consistent with controlled landing or directed energy application than impact. Biological effects surrounding crater sites provide additional evidence of non-conventional energy exposure. Vegetation within and immediately surrounding the craters exhibits luminescence for several nights following crater formation. The glow is faint, visible only in complete darkness, and concentrated in plant sap and actively growing tissues. Chemical analysis finds no bioluminescent organisms responsible for the effect. The light appears to result from stimulated fluorescence of normal plant compounds, as if the vegetation were exposed to radiation that excited molecular structures into unstable states that then relaxed slowly over several days. The specific wavelengths emitted match no known natural fluorescence patterns, suggesting that whatever energy produced, the craters also induced unusual chemical changes in surrounding biological matter. Animal behavior around crater sites shows permanent aversion. Wildlife avoids the areas for years after formation, with paths and territories that previously crossed the sites being abandoned or redirected. This aversion persists long after any detectable radiation or chemical contamination has decayed to background levels, suggesting either that residual traces remain below instrumental detection thresholds but above animal sensitivity, or that animals respond to some non-physical property of the sites, possibly memory of trauma if the energy events produced sound, light, or other sensory stimuli frightening to wildlife. Birds particularly avoid flying over crater sites, creating gaps in otherwise continuous flight patterns that are observable through patient observation and remain stable across breeding generations, implying either learned avoidance, transmitted culturally, or genetic adaptation. Cultural responses to black ships across different societies and time periods reveal recurring themes that provide circumstantial evidence about the vessel's nature and effects. Cult groups, particularly those with roots in or connections to the Church of Starry Wisdom and its derivatives, interpret the ships as divine fairies transporting chosen souls to the cold dominions, variously understood as outer space, higher dimensions, or afterlife realms associated with particular cosmic entities. Cult liturgies describe rituals for calling the dark transports, procedures allegedly allowing adherents to signal their willingness for collection and transport to these outer realms. Whether these rituals achieve any actual effect remains unproven, but their existence demonstrates that certain groups have developed belief systems treating the black ships as accessible rather than merely observable phenomena. The rituals typically involve periods of sensory deprivation, meditation focused on void or darkness concepts, and symbolic offerings, often texts or artifacts presumed valuable to the entities operating the ships, left at specific geographic locations during predicted transit windows. No confirmed cases exist of individuals being transported through these means, though several cult members have disappeared from ritual sites without trace, disappearances that could represent successful transport, coincidental deaths with bodies lost, or deliberate departure under cover of supernatural explanation. Maritime folk traditions from Kingsport and other coastal New England communities contain references to lantern bearers of the deep sky, entities or vessels that travel between stars and periodically approach Earth. The traditions prescribe specific behaviors when these beings are expected, extinguishing coastal lights to signal non-hostility or avoid attracting unwanted attention, remaining indoors during certain astronomical configurations, and refraining from looking directly at unusual lights or movements in the night sky. These prescriptions closely parallel protocols developed independently by researchers studying the shining trapezohedron, whose activation appears linked to light and whose associated entity, the haunter of the dark, manifests through light but operates in darkness. The convergence of folk tradition and scientific observation suggests either that traditional communities independently discovered through trial and error the same operational principles that formal research later identified, or that both traditions draw on older, transmitted knowledge whose origins predate both. Some folk accounts explicitly link the sky-traveling entities to older oceanic traditions about beings dwelling beneath waves, suggesting continuity between the Deep One's mythology and whatever intelligence operates the black ships. Whether this continuity represents actual relationship between different non-human species or simply human pattern-making, grouping all anomalous phenomena into a single mythic framework, cannot be determined from available evidence. Across all cultural interpretations, the thematic core remains consistent. Light attracts attention, darkness provides transport or protection, and the vehicles or beings associated with the black ships trade in information, consciousness, or souls rather than material goods. This consistent theme across independent cultural contexts implies either that the theme accurately reflects the phenomenon's nature, that the ships truly do transport consciousness or information rather than physical cargo, or that human psychology consistently interprets ambiguous phenomena through this particular conceptual lens, finding it more comprehensible to imagine mind transport than to accept alternatives that might be even stranger. Institutional consensus, documented in classified memoranda circulated among cooperating universities and government agencies, classifies black ships as Type D extraterrestrial logistics vehicles, unmanned, unverified. The designation conveys several judgments. Extraterrestrial indicates origin beyond Earth, whether from other planets, other dimensions, or other temporal positions. Logistics emphasizes transport and infrastructure function rather than exploration or combat roles. unmanned expresses the assessment that no biological crew operates the vessels in conventional sense, though this remains uncertain. Unverified acknowledges that despite decades of documentation and analysis, definitive proof of the vessel's physical reality, as opposed to some form of mass perceptual phenomenon, has not been achieved to satisfaction of all analysts. The probability assessments attached to the classification reflect institutional caution. Intelligent oversight of the vessels is rated as highly probable. The precision of trajectories and timing argues against purely natural phenomena, but the nature of that intelligence remains unspecified. The probability of beneficial or meaningful human interaction is officially discouraged, a policy position reflecting recognition that contact attempts have either failed or produced ambiguous results while carrying risks of unknown magnitude. The subtext is that whatever intelligences operate the black ships have shown no interest in human contact beyond whatever activities they conduct during their passages, and that forcing interaction could attract forms of attention humanity is unprepared to handle. Analytical frameworks synthesizing the various models suggest that elements from all three major hypotheses may be partially correct. The ships could be elder thing relics, explaining their age and robustness, that were later repurposed or seized by the MI-Go, explaining their operational integration with Yuggoth-based networks, and now serve primarily as Yithian archives or transport systems, explaining their apparent cargo of consciousness or information. Alternatively, each model might describe different vessels that human observers have incorrectly grouped together. What are called black ships might represent several distinct phenomena with superficial similarities, but fundamentally different origins and purposes. The most unsettling interpretation treats the various models not as competing hypotheses, but as different aspects of a single truth, too large for human comprehension to grasp completely. Perhaps the ships are simultaneously elder thing relics, MI-Go transport infrastructure, and Yithian archives because the beings involved in creating and operating them do not recognize the categorical distinctions humans impose. At cosmic scales, and with technologies operating across dimensions and time, the categories of physical transport, consciousness transfer, and information storage might blur or merge. The ships might represent a technology where transporting an object, transmitting information about it, and preserving its pattern in memory storage are functionally identical operations, different only from the perspective of beings trapped in single temporal positions and limited to three-dimensional thinking. The evidence, fragmentary and ambiguous as it is, supports one conclusion with confidence. Something crosses the void on regular schedules, following routes that suggest purpose and intelligence, operating through principles that exceed human understanding, and producing effects that are real even if their causes remain mysterious. Whether control of these vessels represents active command by living operators or merely the continuing function of ancient automated systems makes little practical difference to humans who observe their passage. The ships appear, they transit, they occasionally leave traces, and then they depart. Attempts to interfere have not succeeded. Attempts at communication have produced minimal response. The best available option remains passive observation, careful documentation, and acceptance that some questions may lack answers accessible to beings whose existence is measured in decades and whose perception is limited to a narrow slice of reality's full spectrum. Function emerges not from direct observation, which remains impossible, but from trajectory analysis, residue examination, and correlation with terrestrial anomalies that suggest causal relationship between black ship activity and phenomena occurring on Earth and possibly throughout the solar system. The vessels operate as transfer mechanisms rather than exploration craft, following fixed corridors that link identifiable nodes. The outer solar system region associated with Yuggoth, intermediate waypoints in the asteroid belt or near gas giant orbits, and variable approach points near Earth that cluster over northern polar latitudes. The routes show no characteristics of exploratory survey, no deviation to investigate novel objects, no adjustment based on changing celestial configurations beyond predictable orbital mechanics, but display instead the rigid adherence to schedule and path typical of logistics networks optimized for efficiency rather than discovery. Each documented passage leaves microscopic residue detectable through specialized collection and analysis techniques. High-altitude atmospheric sampling conducted during and immediately after predicted transit windows recovers particulate matter distinct from normal cosmic dust, volcanic aerosols, or industrial pollution. The particles are crystalline, typically measuring between 1 and 10 micrometers in length, with morphology showing geometric regularity that suggests formation through controlled processes rather than natural crystallization. Optical analysis reveals refractive indices, measures of how the crystals bend light, that fall outside the range of known terrestrial or meteoritic minerals, but match closely with values measured for the metallic components of MyGo brain. Cylinders recovered during the Vermont investigation. Chemical composition of the crystalline residue shows silicon, carbon, and trace metals in ratios that do not correspond to any standard mineral formula. The structure appears to be a complex lattice with voids or channels running through it at the nanometer scale, suggesting either extreme porosity or designed internal architecture. When exposed to electromagnetic fields, the crystals exhibit weak piezoelectric effects, generating small electrical charges in response to mechanical stress, and show anomalous magnetic susceptibility that varies with temperature in non-linear ways. These properties align with theoretical requirements for information storage at molecular scales, raising the possibility that the residue represents not waste or debris, but deliberately distributed data carriers, seeds of information scattered during each passage. The simplest functional interpretation treats the black ships as cargo vessels, exchanging biological specimens, manufactured goods, or raw materials between allied non-human species. Under this model, the MyGo maintain mining or research operations on Earth, extracting rare elements or conducting studies requiring terrestrial conditions. And the black ships provide logistics support, delivering equipment and supplies from Yuggoth-based manufacturing, retrieving processed materials or research outputs, and maintaining supply chains that allow sustained operations without requiring the MyGo to develop extensive terrestrial industrial infrastructure. The regular schedule supports routine resupply rather than emergency response, and the multiple node structure allows efficient routing between various points of interest across the solar system. This model accounts for much of the observed evidence. The electromagnetic signatures consistent with MyGo technology, the trajectories linking Earth and Yuggoth, and the apparent cargo capacity of vessels measuring hundreds of meters in length all fit logically with an interplanetary transport network. The model struggles, however, to explain certain features. Why are no loading or unloading operations ever observed at Earth approach points? Why does the residue suggest information storage rather than industrial materials? Why has no crashed or disabled black ship ever been recovered, despite decades of regular transits that should statistically produce at least occasional mechanical failures? The model works if the black ships represent only the observable tip of a much larger logistics infrastructure whose other components, surface facilities, transfer stations, local transport vehicles, operate below human detection thresholds or in locations humans have not discovered. The more complex and disturbing interpretation treats the black ships as cosmic maintenance systems, vessels that redistribute matter, energy, and information to maintain equilibrium among dimensional planes, planetary systems, or reality. Structures whose stability requires active regulation. Under this model, The ships are not transporting cargo for economic or scientific purposes, but performing adjustments that prevent catastrophic instabilities, the cosmic equivalent of maintenance technicians who keep infrastructure functioning by making regular rounds, checking critical systems, and correcting deviations before they cascade into failures. Earth is not a destination, but a node requiring periodic servicing, a junction point in a network spanning scales that dwarf planetary concerns. Evidence supporting the maintenance interpretation comes from correlation analysis between black ship activity and terrestrial anomalies. Statistical studies conducted at Miskatonic beginning in the 1940s document that periods when black ships fail to appear on schedule, either skipping predicted transits or appearing with significant timing delays, correlate with increased incidence of various anomalous phenomena on Earth. Dream plagues, outbreaks of unusual psychological disturbances affecting large populations simultaneously, spike during these gaps. Reports of encounters with non-human entities or intrusions from other dimensional spaces increase. Most dramatically, events similar to the color out of space contamination, instances where reality itself seems to malfunction locally, producing sterility, bizarre life forms, or areas where physical laws operate abnormally, occur with significantly higher frequency during periods of black ship absence. The correlation coefficient between ship schedule disruptions and paranormal incident rates exceeds 0.9, a value that in conventional statistics would indicate extremely strong association. The relationship appears causal rather than merely correlative. The anomalies increase after ship absences rather than before them, suggesting that the absences cause or enable the anomalies rather than both being effects of some common cause. The timescales involved span months to years. A missed transit in 1 year correlates with elevated anomaly rates over the following 12 to 36 months, implying that whatever maintenance the ships perform has protective effects that decay slowly rather than collapsing immediately when service lapses. The mechanism by which black ships might perform cosmic maintenance remains speculative. One hypothesis proposes that the ships reinforce dimensional boundaries, applying energy or information that strengthens the barriers separating different planes of existence. Without this reinforcement, the boundaries weaken, allowing leakage between dimensions that manifests as paranormal phenomena, entities crossing over, physical laws from one dimension bleeding into another, or consciousness from different reality states interpenetrating. The crystalline residue could be repair material, microscopic structures that embed themselves in dimensional fabric and maintain integrity through their presence, requiring periodic replenishment as they degrade or are consumed. An alternative mechanism treats the ships as information couriers, maintaining a cosmic database or library that various intelligences use for coordination. If multiple non-human species operate on Earth or in the solar system, they require methods to avoid conflicts, coordinate activities, and share information about conditions and resources. The black ships could distribute updates to this database, delivering packets of information that allow dispersed entities to maintain synchronized understanding of situations without requiring direct real-time communication. The breakdown of this information network during ship absences would lead to coordination failures, with different entities inadvertently interfering with each other or with terrestrial conditions, producing the observed upticks in anomalous events. A third possibility, drawing on Yithian concepts, treats the ships as temporal stabilizers that prevent causality violations or timeline divergences from accumulating to dangerous levels. If consciousness can be projected across time, if entities can manipulate past events, or if multiple timeline branches coexist, then some mechanism must exist to resolve contradictions and maintain coherent history. The black ships might survey timelines during their transits, identifying points where divergence threatens stability, and apply corrections, perhaps through very subtle physical interventions whose effects propagate forward to prevent larger instabilities. In this model, the ships control not space but time, and their passages represent not movement through 3 dimensions, but editing operations performed on the 4-dimensional structure of space-time. Field analysts who have spent decades studying the phenomenon increasingly describe it using maintenance metaphors rather than exploration or transportation language. Internal memoranda circulated among cleared researchers refer to cosmic plumbing, dimensional HVAC systems, and reality's janitorial services. The tone is sometimes sardonic but reflects a genuine conceptual shift. The black ships are understood not as visitors or invaders, but as infrastructure, as background processes that keep larger systems functioning. Their visibility to humans is incidental, an artifact of human observation capabilities, happening to detect phenomena that were never intended for detection, and whose purposes are indifferent to whether any observer notices them. The strategic implications depend critically on identifying the controlling intelligence or system. If the MyGo operate the ships, then strategy involves logistics and resource extraction. Earth is valuable for its materials or its position, and the ships maintain supply lines supporting MyGo objectives. If Elder Thing remnants or automated systems continue ancient programs, then strategy involves maintenance of very long-term projects whose goals were set millions of years ago and may no longer be relevant to current conditions. If a trans-universal bureaucracy or cosmic intelligence manages the network, then strategy operates at scales where individual planets are insignificant except as components in larger equilibria, and human concerns are noise in a system whose purposes are fundamentally alien. Regardless of specific identity, the controlling intelligence exercises authority without occupation, a model that differs fundamentally from territorial conquest or colonial administration. The intelligence requires only access, the ability to approach Earth periodically, perform whatever operations the ships conduct, and depart without interference. No permanent presence is established, no resources are consumed in quantities that significantly affect terrestrial availability, and no apparent attempt is made to control or direct human activities. The void itself is territory in this framework. Planetary surfaces are merely points of interest, terminals in a network whose real infrastructure exists in the spaces between worlds. Humans encounter only the reflection of transactions, operating at scales that dwarf individual planets. When black ships pass near Earth, human observers see shadows or afterimages of processes whose full extent spans light years or dimensions. The actual cargo, whether material, informational, or something for which humans lack appropriate categories, moves through channels human instruments cannot detect except through indirect traces. The visible passages might represent merely synchronization points, where different phases of a larger operation align briefly in observable space before diverging again into unobservable domains. This perspective explains the apparent indifference of the ship operators to human observation. From the operator's viewpoint, humans noticing black ship passages is equivalent to ants noticing aircraft passing overhead, possible but irrelevant to the aircraft's operations, and not something that would cause the aircraft to modify its flight path or schedule. The ants might develop theories about the aircraft, might fear them or worship them or ignore them, but none of these responses would affect whether the aircraft continue flying their routes. Similarly, human responses to black ships, observation, fear, attempts at communication, do not register as significant to entities operating at cosmic scales, with interests spanning geological or even cosmological timeframes. Operational doctrine developed by institutional researchers reflects recognition of these scale disparities and the asymmetric power relationships they imply. The doctrine, codified and classified memoranda, maintained at Miskatonic's Astronomical Annex and shared among cooperating institutions, provides guidelines for institutional response to black ship activity. The guidelines are framed not as methods for controlling or influencing the phenomenon, but as strategies for minimizing risk while maintaining observational capacity. The tone is defensive rather than assertive, acknowledging that humans are not players in whatever games the black ships serve, but merely bystanders who can at best avoid being accidentally damaged. The first directive, do not signal. Any transmission directed at black ships or sent during predicted transit windows risks attracting attention that institutional consensus judges undesirable. The reasoning is that if the ship's operators are currently unaware of or indifferent to human presence, attracting their attention could change that status unpredictably. If they become aware of humans as conscious observers rather than merely environmental features, they might respond in ways that range from negligible to catastrophic. Even if the response is benign by the operator's standards, perhaps an information download or consciousness sampling they consider a gift, the effects on human recipients could be devastating if the information or experience exceeds human cognitive capacity to process. Historical precedent supports caution. Individuals who claim close encounters with non-human intelligences, whether MyGo, Yithian, or others, consistently report psychological trauma, cognitive disruption, or permanent alterations to their mental state. The brain cylinders used by MyGo produce profound existential distress in their human contents. Contact with Yithian consciousness leaves persistent alterations in perception and memory. If black ship operators employ similar technologies or operate through similar principles, deliberate contact initiation could produce equivalent effects at larger scales, potentially affecting entire research teams or institutions rather than individuals. The second directive, do not observe directly. This guidance specifically addresses instrumental observation, particularly attempts to use active sensor systems, radar, LiDAR, or other technologies that emit signals toward the target and detect reflections. Multiple attempts to scan black ships using these methods have resulted in instrument damage, with equipment suffering failures that require extensive repair or replacement. The failures appear to result from feedback, energy emitted by the sensors being reflected or amplified somehow and returned to the instruments at levels exceeding their design tolerances. Whether this represents deliberate defense mechanism, automatic countermeasure, or simply physical property of the ship's surfaces remains unknown, but the practical result is that active sensing attempts are counterproductive. Passive observation using telescopes, photographic systems, and receivers that detect naturally emitted or reflected radiation is permitted under the doctrine but subject to constraints. Observations must be logged immediately, with time-stamped records created to establish priority and prevent later alteration. Multiple independent observers should confirm significant sightings when possible. Most importantly, observations should remain classified, with data shared only among authorized researchers and institutions, preventing public awareness that might generate demands for more aggressive investigation or sensational media coverage that could interfere with systematic study. The third directive, maintain blackout during predicted windows. This guidance addresses local conditions at observation sites during periods when black ship passages are expected. All non-essential lighting should be extinguished, electromagnetic emissions minimized, and human activity reduced to essential operations only. The reasoning combines several concerns. First, the folk tradition, wisdom that light attracts attention from the ships or their operators, a tradition that might reflect accumulated empirical knowledge, even if the mechanism is not understood. Second, the possibility that human activity creates interference that degrades observational data quality, making it harder to detect the subtle signals associated with passages. Third, The precautionary principle that minimizing human presence during transits reduces whatever risks might be associated with them, even if those risks are poorly characterized. The blackout protocols extend beyond simple light elimination to encompass broader effort to reduce human observability. Radio transmissions are curtailed during transit windows, with only essential communications permitted and those using minimum necessary power. Radar systems are shut down entirely. Vehicle traffic near observation sites is restricted. The goal is to make the observation site and surrounding area appear as inactive and uninteresting as possible, reducing the probability that ship operators would notice or care about the location. The protocols implicitly treat the ships as possessing sensor capabilities far exceeding human technology, capable of detecting not just visible light, but the full electromagnetic spectrum and possibly additional sensing modalities humans cannot yet conceive. The fourth directive, if approached, feign absence. This represents the most extreme guidance, applied only in the hypothetical scenario where black ships deviate from normal trajectories and approach ground locations or low-altitude airspace where direct human-ship encounters become possible. The protocol specifies complete cessation of all observable activity, no movement, no emissions, no actions that might indicate conscious presence. Personnel are instructed to remain motionless, maintain silence, and avoid any behavior that might be interpreted as responsive to the ship's presence. The underlying logic treats consciousness or agency recognition as the critical threshold, as long as the ship's operators perceive humans as unconscious environmental features, equivalent to rocks or trees. No interaction occurs, but if they recognize humans as conscious agents, interaction becomes possible with unknown consequences. The feign absence protocol has never been implemented under actual conditions, and some researchers question whether it would prove effective if needed. If the ship's operators possess technology capable of detecting consciousness directly, reading minds, sensing nervous system activity, or identifying the organized complexity characteristic of biological intelligence, then behavioral protocols based on mimicking unconsciousness would fail immediately. The protocol represents institutional effort to define some response to worst-case scenarios, even while acknowledging that the response might prove inadequate. Reconstruction of black ship interiors through psychic impression analysis provides disturbing glimpses into what the vessels might contain. The reconstruction effort began in the 1950s after several individuals with documented psychic sensitivity reported spontaneous visions or dreams that they associated with black ship passages. The visions occurred during sleep, but with unusual vividness and consistency across different subjects who had no contact with each other. Researchers at Miskatonic conducted careful interviews using techniques developed for witness interrogation and cognitive psychology, attempting to extract detailed descriptions while minimizing the influence of suggestion or expectation. The resulting composite description depicts interiors composed of honeycomb corridors, passages with hexagonal cross-sections that branch and reconnect in three-dimensional networks more complex than simple hallways. The walls appear to be translucent membranes rather than solid barriers, with faint luminescence allowing perception of adjacent spaces without providing clear views. The membranes appear organic or semi-organic, showing slight flexibility and possibly respiratory or circulatory motion, though whether this represents actual biological tissue or advanced materials mimicking biological properties cannot be determined from psychic impressions. Within the honeycomb cells, the spaces defined by the translucent membranes, drift objects described as resembling cocoons, urns, or eggs. The objects are approximately human-sized or slightly larger, smooth-surfaced, and apparently self-contained. They do not rest on floors or attach to walls, but float in orientations suggesting either microgravity environment or active suspension through field effects. The surfaces show no openings, seams, or markings, appearing as seamless shells that could be either containers holding something inside or entire objects whose function is self-contained. Spectral analysis techniques adapted from parapsychology research allow quantitative examination of the psychic impressions. When subjects are asked to focus on their memories of the visions while connected to electroencephalography equipment, their brain activity shows patterns that can be processed through image reconstruction algorithms similar to those used in brain-computer interfaces. The resulting images, essentially photographs of what the subjects remember seeing, show the cocoon-like objects emitting pulse patterns. The pulses appear as regular fluctuations in luminosity, or perhaps in some property that the subjects' minds interpret as light. Frequency analysis of these pulse patterns shows remarkable similarity to neural activity patterns recorded from human brains during normal waking consciousness. This similarity suggests that the containers hold not physical cargo, but consciousness in some form of storage or transport state. The hypothesis is that minds, personalities, or information patterns equivalent to conscious entities are being moved through the vessels, stored in these containers during transit, possibly in suspended or hibernating states. The containers would function as the extraterrestrial equivalent of MyGo brain cylinders, but on a larger scale, designed for extended transport or perhaps permanent storage rather than temporary holding. If the hypothesis is correct, the black ships represent not freight carriers, but passenger vessels or mobile archives, transporting or preserving the consciousnesses of beings whose physical bodies are unnecessary or have been left behind. The passengers or contents could be members of various species traveling between worlds for purposes of exploration, research, or colonization. Alternatively, the ships could be repositories of stored minds, libraries preserving the personalities and memories of extinct civilizations, or backing up consciousness for entities that want insurance against physical death. The regular passages near Earth might represent nothing more than the ship's programmed routes taking them past this location as they travel between other, more important destinations. Derivative phenomena associated with black ship activity provide circumstantial support for various interpretations while introducing additional mysteries. A classified appendix to the main documentation file lists recurring phenomena that appear temporally or geographically correlated with black ship passages, but are distinct from direct observations. The phenomena fall into several categories suggesting different possible causal pathways or relationships. First category, dream phenomena. Multiple subjects report lucid dreams featuring descending corridors, spaces that seem to extend infinitely downward or inward, and sensations of being cataloged or stored in vast repositories. The dreams occur with elevated frequency during weeks surrounding predicted transit windows and are reported by individuals who have no conscious knowledge of black ship schedules and often no interest in or awareness of anomalous phenomena generally. The content consistency across independent subjects suggests either telepathic broadcasting, something about black ship presence inducing shared dream imagery, or that the dreams represent brief, partial contact with actual ship interiors through mechanisms that remain unknown. Second category, acoustic phenomena. Radio receivers, particularly those monitoring very low frequencies below normal voice communication bands, detect recurring hums at approximately 31 Hz. During the days before and after predicted transits, the hum is not continuous, but pulsed, appearing for periods of 10 to 30 minutes before ceasing, then returning hours later. The frequency is too low for most speakers to reproduce audibly, but when converted to higher frequencies through signal processing, the hum resolves into complex patterns with mathematical structures suggesting informational content rather than random noise. Decryption attempts have proven unsuccessful, but pattern analysis shows that the 31 Hz base frequency matches harmonics of the 17 Hz resonance associated with the shining trapezohedron and appears as a multiplier of other frequencies found in MIGO artifact emissions. Third category, material phenomena. University museums and research institutions occasionally receive anonymous donations of small metallic fragments, typically delivered through mail with no return address and minimal packaging. The fragments are usually irregular in shape, measuring a few centimeters in largest dimension, with surfaces showing no tool marks or obvious manufacturing traces. Chemical analysis reveals alloys or pure metals in isotopic ratios that do not match terrestrial abundance patterns. Most significantly, one fragment analyzed extensively shows isotopic decay characteristics incompatible with any known exposure to cosmic radiation, solar wind, or natural radioactivity. The decay pattern suggests that certain isotopes in the fragment have undergone transmutation or decay at rates thousands of times slower than their natural half-lives would predict. This could result from shielding by unknown materials or fields that prevent normal decay processes, or from the fragment spending time in environments where fundamental physical constants differ from terrestrial values. Higher dimensional spaces, regions with different vacuum energy density, or temporal stasis where time passes at altered rates relative to normal space. The practical implication is that the fragments might be hundreds of thousands of years old, despite their metallurgical characteristics appearing consistent with much more recent manufacture. The absence of clear documentation about the fragments' origins prevents direct connection to black ships. But the timing of deliveries correlates with recent transit windows, suggesting that someone or something deliberately distributes samples following the ship's passages. The purpose could be communication attempt, providing physical evidence to demonstrate reality and advanced technology. It could be waste disposal, fragments that became detached during operations and are being delivered to institutions that might safely contain them. Or it could be seeding, deliberately introducing material whose properties will influence terrestrial development in subtle ways over long timescales. By mid-century, international coordination of black ship monitoring reaches formalization through Project Nocturne, a classified collaboration involving observatories and research institutions across multiple nations. The project operates under scientific cover, publicly described as a meteor survey program, but its actual mission focuses exclusively on detecting, tracking, and analyzing black ship activity. Participation is voluntary and informal, bound not by treaties or official agreements, but by shared scientific interest and mutual recognition that the phenomenon is real, significant, and worthy of systematic study, despite its apparent immunity to conventional investigation. Project Nocturne establishes standardized observation protocols, ensuring that data collected at different sites is compatible and can be combined for analysis. Participating institutions agree to share observations within restricted channels, maintaining databases that compile sighting reports, trajectory calculations, and auxiliary phenomena across decades. The accumulated data reveals patterns not visible in individual observations, particularly regarding the ship's approach and departure behaviors. All participants report the same puzzling outcome. The ships vanish when they reach angular distances below the detection threshold, typically when they appear smaller than approximately 1 arc-minute as viewed from Earth. The vanishing is not gradual fading, as one would expect from objects receding to distances where they become too dim or small to observe. Instead, ships that are clearly visible one moment simply cease to be visible the next, with no intermediate state. The transition is binary, present or absent, and occurs simultaneously across all observation wavelengths, from radio through visible light to gamma rays. This behavior suggests not that the ships travel beyond observation range, but that they transition into states or dimensions where they cannot be detected, essentially folding out of observable space rather than accelerating away through it. Predictive models developed within Project Nocturne attempt to forecast when and where future passages will occur, allowing institutions to position assets optimally and coordinate observations. The predictions rely primarily on astronomical parameters, particularly lunar node alignments, the points where the moon's orbital plane intersects the ecliptic plane. These nodes process through the zodiac with a period of approximately 18.6 years, and black ship activity shows correlation with specific node positions. The correlation is not perfect, but when node position is combined with solar activity cycles, planetary configurations, and secular changes in Earth's magnetic field, prediction accuracy reaches approximately 70% for major transits. Current projections, calculated in the early 21st century, place the next major transit window within the coming decade, with highest probability falling in the period surrounding specific astronomical configurations that occur rarely. The projections carry substantial uncertainty. Previous predictions have been off by months or years, and unexpected passages occur with some regularity, but they provide sufficient guidance to allow institutions to prepare, ensuring that observation assets are maintained and personnel are available during likely windows. Philosophical implications of the black ship phenomenon dominate internal debates within institutions studying it. If the ships operate according to rigid schedules maintained across centuries or millennia, they represent governance or regulation operating at cosmic scale. The governance need not be conscious or intended. It could be purely mechanical, the automatic functioning of systems established long ago and never modified. But whether conscious or automatic, the effect is the same: enforcement of order, maintenance of equilibrium, and continuation of processes that transcend individual planetary timelines. The ships could represent the visible manifestation of what amounts to cosmic civil service, bureaucratic entities ensuring that regulations are followed, that systems function according to specification, and that violations or failures are detected and corrected. If reality itself requires administration to prevent it from falling into chaos or fragmenting into incompatible domains, then the ships are the administrators, making rounds on schedules determined by necessity rather than convenience. Their indifference to humanity would reflect not malice, but simply that humans are not relevant to their administrative functions, being too small and short-lived to register as factors requiring consideration. Alternatively, control might not represent command in any conventional sense, but rather continuation of function long after original purposes have been forgotten or rendered irrelevant. The ships might be automated systems continuing to execute programs written millions of years ago by intelligences that are now extinct or have evolved beyond needing physical spacecraft. The programs run not because anyone currently wants them to run, but because they were designed with such robustness and self-maintenance capability that they persist autonomously. Control in this reading means not that the ships are controlled, but that they are control. They embody regulation and order as intrinsic properties rather than as imposed external requirements. This interpretation transforms the question, who controls the black ships, into a meditation on autonomy and purpose at cosmic scales. If a machine operates for 1,000,000 years after its creators have vanished, executing functions that no longer serve any entity's interests, does it remain a tool or has it become something else? The black ships might represent the ultimate expression of automation, systems so well designed that they achieve functional immortality, continuing indefinitely while the circumstances that made them necessary change beyond recognition. They cross the void not because any intelligence directs them, but because crossing is their nature, movement their purpose, and continuation their only imperative. Current institutional classification designates black ships as active, autonomous, non-hostile, pending contradictory evidence. The active designation indicates ongoing operations detected through multiple independent channels. Autonomous reflects the assessment that no biological operators control the vessels in real time, with operations instead following pre-programmed protocols or artificial intelligence systems. Non-hostile acknowledges that despite decades of observation, no black ship has taken any action interpretable as aggressive toward human interests. No weapons discharge, no interference with terrestrial infrastructure, no abductions or hostile contact beyond what is minimally required for whatever their actual functions are. The classification could change if new evidence emerges, and protocols exist for escalating response levels if ships deviate from established behavioral patterns. But current assessment treats the phenomenon as environmental rather than adversarial, something to be monitored and avoided rather than opposed or defended against. Containment is recognized as impossible. The ships cross interstellar or interdimensional distances with apparent ease, operate in vacuum without visible life support or propulsion, and show no vulnerability to anything in human arsenals. Observation is necessarily restricted by practical limits. Instruments that can detect the ships across relevant distances while not being damaged by exposure are rare and expensive, requiring institutional resources that limit how many observation posts can be maintained. The final memorandum from the Miskatonic Astronomical Annex, dated to the early 1960s and still considered definitive despite its age, summarizes institutional position with remarkable conciseness. Who controls them? No one, and that is the control. They travel because movement is their obedience, silence their command. The statement resolves the question not by providing an answer, but by reframing the question itself. Control need not imply controller. The ships control their own operations through whatever principles govern their function, whether those principles were originally imposed by designers or have emerged through evolution or development that gave the ships something approaching autonomy. The movement is obedience not to external commands, but to internal programming or purpose that has been so thoroughly integrated into the ship's architecture that distinguishing between following orders and exercising autonomy becomes meaningless. The silence is command in the sense that the ship's operators, if any exist, have chosen or defaulted to policy of minimal communication, maintaining operations without explanation or justification, treating their purposes as self-evident or irrelevant to external audiences. The silence commands humans to remain ignorant, to speculate endlessly, and ultimately to accept that some questions lack answers accessible through current methods or perhaps through any methods humans might develop. Case status remains ongoing observation, an acknowledgement that the phenomenon continues and that monitoring continues despite the limited returns such monitoring provides. Visibility forecast is minimal, reflecting both the ship's operational characteristics. They are difficult to detect even when present, and the policy of restricting public awareness to prevent panic, interference, or demands for actions that institutions are unable to execute effectively. Probability of direct contact is listed as none desired, a diplomatic phrasing that conveys institutional consensus that attempting contact would be inadvisable at best and potentially catastrophic at worst, while leaving theoretical possibility open that contact might occur despite lack of desire, should the ships or their operators decide to initiate it. The black ships continue their passages following schedules maintained across centuries, depositing their microscopic residues, occasionally leaving craters or traces that confirm their physical reality while revealing nothing about their purposes. Human observation networks track them when possible, record what can be recorded, and maintain archives documenting a phenomenon that proves simultaneously mundane, regular, predictable, repetitive, and utterly alien in its indifference to human concerns and its resistance to human comprehension. The ships cross the void because the void requires crossing, because equilibria require maintenance, or because ancient commands remain unrevoked, even as the commanders have vanished into time's depths. Whether they represent transport infrastructure, reality maintenance systems, or automated archives preserving consciousnesses from extinct civilizations matters less than the recognition that they operate at scales where human categories prove inadequate and human agency proves irrelevant. The cosmos maintains itself through mechanisms humans can observe but not direct, serving purposes humans can speculate about but not verify, following imperatives that dwarf human concerns, while occasionally intersecting with human experience in ways that leave traces, questions, and the disturbing recognition that humanity exists within systems it did not create and cannot control.